Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Sunday Sit Down. I'm Reverend Phil Dieke. I'm so glad to welcome you this morning on Palm Sunday. This is our Sunday Sit Down. We do it before worship every Sunday as an opportunity to have a conversation and to kind of get ourselves primed and ready to go for worship. And so the last couple of weeks, I've had a different clergy person on from churches around the area here in Dallas talking about Lent and different Lenten practices and what Lent looked like for them growing up. Because of some situations that have taken place in our country, specifically around mass shootings and different things happening, especially around the Asian American Pacific Islander community, I invited Victoria to come on and join me this morning. And I was going to potentially reach out to one of our Asian American clergy people in our conference. And then I thought, you know what? Vic and I actually had a conversation and said, it just makes way more sense to talk to somebody that people know already. Yeah. And it's not that we don't have great people in our conference, but this just makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah.
So
I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you for coming, because I was going to ask you how you're doing, but it's probably a dumb question because it's been a really hard week and a half, and it's more than just a week and a half or 2 weeks, right? But it's just been exacerbated.
Yeah, totally. I think that there have been a lot of people who've reached out and various ways that people have reached out, but I think the general sentiment is that I'm just really tired and like we were talking about before we got on today, I didn't get a lot of work done 2 weeks ago because I was really exhausted and tired, and I don't think that I've cooked in 10 days.
Is that because if Jessie said that, my wife, it'd be it'd be a celebrated thing. I haven't had to cook in 10 days.
No, it's that's abnormal.
You like to cook though,
yeah,
right?
I do like to cook. And usually not cooking is a sign of I don't really have energy at the end of the day to do another thing. And so that's kind of where we've been at. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you for taking the time to do this. And I know it's a vulnerable space to be, so I appreciate it. Yeah, so I know a lot of us last summer, when everything was happening with Black Lives Matter and a lot of the racial kind of reckoning that was taking place here around George Floyd, spent a lot of time educating ourselves and realizing that specifically as white people, that we have a lot of work to do to educate ourselves. What I had the realization a week and a half, 2 weeks ago was that I clearly know very little, if anything at all, about the history of Asian American and what that journey has been for them. And so I think I never really put that together, right? That there's a whole nother minority here that has a very detailed story and complicated story. Yeah. And so one of the things I would love to talk about is just, what does that education look like for you? And we could share some resources too and talk about that. But what does education look like for you in terms of this? Yeah.
So I will start by saying that the reason that you and lots of other people don't really know that the Asian American community has this deep, rich history is actually a symptom of white supremacy. That it's not that we haven't been here. It's not that terrible things have not happened to Asians and various people within the race of Asian. Yep. It's that those stories have been intentionally erased and left out. And one of the things that I think was really significant for me and for a lot of Asian Americans that I saw a lot on social media and in conversations with friends and family members was that the conversation around Black Lives Matter has very much to do with the Asian American community, in part because we as Asian Americans represent something called the model minority, which if you've never heard that term, you can look it up on the internet and there's lots of information on it.
Well, and it's good to bring it up because I kept seeing it and I kind of understand what it is, but I still you could probably do some clarifying for me here.
So the model minority is basically this stereotype that says that Asian Americans have earned their status in society through merit and hard work, which is true. And I think that anybody who knows, Asian American immigrants, my father, my family, they work really hard to get to where they are. Yeah. But it also, the other half of the model minority says that because Asian Americans have worked their way up the ladder, so we say, and they are as close to white as any other race could be, why can't the rest of you do it? Something that I have literally heard said by Asian Americans is, well, we have pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. Why can't the Black community? Yeah. And that is actually right there. The problem with the model minority example is because it actually puts Asian Americans against the rest of people of color in the United States. And the model minority myth really actually came about after World War II. And so if you're unfamiliar with some of basic history of Asians in America, I'll give you a very short synopsis.
Yeah, sure.
So Asian Americans, particularly Chinese immigrants, came to the U.S. Right as slavery was ending in the United States, so about 150 years ago. And a big part of that actually had to do with slaves no longer being available workforce, they needed somebody who was going to build the railroads out west.
Right.
And so they invited in Chinese immigrants, particularly men, to start building railroads. But what they quickly discovered is that the Asian American community was not getting paid equally. They're getting paid up to somewhere between 30 and 50% of what their white counterparts were doing. And they were facing significant harassment and discrimination.
Yeah.
And so kind of fast forward a few years, a couple decades, Asian Americans are starting to build out communities for themselves out west because they have been building railroads and they're building communities, which is why you see places like California have a very large Asian population.
Right.
But what happened is that then the white communities in this area felt really threatened. And so they started writing laws. They wrote what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which to this day is the only piece of legislation that was ever written that excluded a group of immigrants based on race. And
Yeah, when this came up, like I saw this the other day and I thought they literally wrote it as the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yes,
That was literally the title.
And do you know when it was repealed? 1965. It was written in 1885 and was not repealed until 1965, which was like 40 years ago. Yeah. Like it was not that 60 years ago. My math is rough.
I know. I always think it's still the year 2000, so
Yes.
it's fine.
But so if you think about it in that scope, and then in that time, the reason the law was actually repealed was because of what happened during World War II with the Japanese internment camps.
Yeah.
And so something like almost 30,000 Japanese American citizens who were of Japanese descent were put in basically concentration camps in the United States. And they were forced to work and they were shot and they were beat if they tried to leave.
Because they thought they were spies, right?
Because they thought they were spies, because they thought they were aligned with Japan during World War II.
Right.
And the government very quickly after the World War II ended realized what a horrible thing they had done.
Yeah.
And they actually did pay reparations to the Japanese community, which is something that they have
Really?
not done to the black community, which I think is very important.
Yeah.
And then they said, oh, look at how well Asian Americans are doing. Black people, Latinx people, and indigenous people be like the Asian American community when like our stories are so different. And that discrepancy between the experiences created this huge divide in reality between the Asian American community and the rest of people of color in the United States. And so when lately I've been seeing a lot of like COVID has started all this hate against Asians. And
Right.
I'm like, the hate has always been there,
Right.
But it's buried in our books in a way that we never talk about it.
Yeah.
So there you go. There's like a 3 minutes.
Okay, but take a deep breath, right? That's a whole lot. Also, you're saying that reparations, just income, money can actually help people.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Like,
yeah,
universal basic income. What? No, I'm
Yeah.
just kidding. Okay, we're not going to go there. Okay, so that's a lot, right? Yeah, it's frustrating too, right? It's so frustrating that so many of those things I never learned in history class, and
I didn't learn them. I didn't learn them. I spent this summer like learning from Asian American educators, Googling like what is like the Chinese lynching I'm not gonna remember the year. You can look it up. The Chinese mass lynching. They look it up. It's
right.
the historians say the largest mass lynching that was ever committed in U.S. history.
Oh, wow.
I had never heard of that until this summer. And when I'm reading about it, and it's like, if I identify as part of this community, my father is an immigrant, like my family is like in a lot of ways the American success story.
Right.
I know these stories. How can I explain them to my kids, to the people I work with, to people in my life when like you don't know them, I don't know them, they're
Right.
just like lost stories.
yeah, I remember last year being so frustrated that I learned about the Tulsa Massacre from an HBO show. Like, why is HBO educating me on something that happened 99 years ago, right? Like, it took them that long to actually put it. And I wonder how many of those things are happening to the Asian American community as well that we're going to learn because finally somebody's going to put it into a TV show or a movie or something, and we're all going to say, wait, that's just fiction, right?
Yeah.
Oh no, that was
that's
actually
real.
based
Yeah.
on real
Yeah.
things that happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's wildly frustrating.
Yeah.
You said you did a whole lot of Googling,
Yeah.
right? And we can talk about resources. I think we can share some resources in the chat that you can have access to. We'll put some of that stuff in there. Is there anything or like followers or people that you've just really clung to, and anytime you have questions about things, that's like the place you go back to?
Yeah. So I've actually made like, I think that people at White Rock might know this about, maybe not. I really love the world of Instagram, and I like believe in its power to create community.
Sure.
And there are actually a number of people on Instagram that I have like developed friendships with over the years that are Asian American activists and educators in various capacities. I'll put them in the chat, but there are a couple of folks who have Patreon accounts that I really recommend.
Yeah.
One of them, her name is Liz Kleinrock. She is an educator out of DC, and she is a Korean American adoptee, which is like a whole other layer of like the Asian American experience.
Oh yeah, we'll come back to that.
Of being raised, in a family. But she has some really wonderful resources and educational pieces around how to have these conversations and what are like the pieces that are missing from classrooms, especially if you're an educator and you're a teacher. We have lots of teachers at White Rock.
Yeah.
But also just like general knowledge about like even like great stuff on like the history of Black and Asian solidarity over the past like 70 years. And that kind of thing that like is, I think, really vital to like the healing of the violence that both of our communities have participated in.
Sure.
But also talking about like the ways that we've stood in solidarity together. So I really recommend her Patreon page. It's very affordable if you want to subscribe to it, but we'll put that in the link too.
Yeah, and one thing, I've had this conversation with a lot of people lately of like, why would I pay somebody just for information, right? Like we live in the age of information. It's all readily accessible.
Sure.
And the awesome thing is these people put so much stuff in front of a paywall.
Yeah.
And then like if you really want to do a deep dive, then there's stuff behind the paywall.
Yeah.
And like, it's stuff that they've spent their life working on and cultivating and curating. So why would we not pay them to do it, right? It just seems so silly that we wouldn't pay these people for this, right? Like you have a subscription to Dallas Morning News, but also New York Times or whatever your chosen things are. So like, why would you not? Yeah. Right. So I'm a big fan of that. I love that. I love supporting people. I actually have Central Tracks is the one that I actually pay the Patreon for because I love their local news. I think it's so good. Okay. You mentioned Korean American, right? And I think this is an important thing to talk about too, is that you talk about model minority and the Asian American community, the AAPI, like I think there's, it's not a monolith, right?
Totally.
And it's the same for Black people in America too, right? There's not like one Black story that like speaks for everybody. You want to talk a little bit about the different communities and like and how to delineate and what that looks like, and to the best of your experience, right? Like obviously you can't speak for all Asian Americans either. But.
Sure. So one of the things I think is really important, particularly when we're talking about the Asian community, is to distinguish the difference between race and ethnicity. Yep. So race, as we have hopefully learned this summer, is a social construct where we kind of group people together based on background, what they look like, culture, those kinds of things. Ethnicity has to do with where you're from, where your lineage is from, where your family's from. And within the Asian American community, Asians Americans as a race, but within our community, there are literally like hundreds of different ethnicities, even within countries. Like you can be of a certain, like you can be Chinese, but you could also be Japanese, and the nuance of that. I think what's really important to understand is that when we talk about the Asian American community, I'll put a link in the chat about this, is that the model minority myth is partially a lie because the experience that we have across the board is not the same. So my family is Chinese American, and what we experience is very different than what a Thai American family experiences or a Hmong American family experiences because they are darker skinned. And that has a huge impact on the way the Asian American community treats people within our community and the way the world sees us. And so statistically, actually, often you see like aggregated data that shows like, one of the most recent ones I saw said like an Asian woman makes $1.12 compared to what a white woman makes, which is like $1 or something like that.
Sure.
And that's not like representative of the reality because while they're usually the highest earning ethnicities within the Asian community are Japanese, Indian, Chinese, not in that order, but those are the top ones. And then you have Koreans kind of next. And then there are folks at the bottom end who are making 50 cents to every dollar that a white woman makes. And so for us to say
and also to include that a white woman makes what, 82 cents to every a male,
a white male.
A white male?
Yes.
Right. So you're talking like
maybe 30 cents on the dollar to what every white man makes. And
this is so relevant because this is the week, right, where it took this long in the year for a woman to catch up to what a man made last year, right?
Yes.
This is good timing.
Yeah. And so thinking about that challenge of diversifying the way we think about Asian Americans is really important because it draws attention to the way that we're not all having the same experience. And the Asian that you might know in your workplace might be very different than the person who works in the back kitchen that you've probably never met because they don't have access to resources and they make 30 cents on the dollar to what you make.
It's a lot. It's a lot going on there. Okay, we have I think about 5 minutes left. Okay. So part of what I wanted to do is just say what are the things that you most want, and it doesn't have to be just our congregation, like what do you want White Rock to know, but what are the things that you wish people knew? Whether that's the experiences you grew up with that have really formed you, or maybe let's just start there. Like, are there things that have really formed you that you just, I mean, I know that we talked about earlier in the week, like the difference between like calling something Oriental versus calling something Asian, right?
Yes.
Like that's something that I learned in college, and I felt like a big doofus because I had no idea that I was offending my friend,
Yeah.
you know, like that, and that was a big learning point for me.
Yeah. So we'll just like briefly talk about language. So I would say that it's okay to call somebody Asian. I would not recommend just assuming that you know what country they're from. That tends to be pretty offensive because it's often wrong.
Sure.
And pretty much any other word other than Asian, AAPI, which is Asian American Pacific Islander, I would just generally avoid. So there are a lot of military slurs, which are like Japs and Gooks, which those are like really off limits. And
I got in trouble for that, and also in like 5th grade for writing a report for my grandpa because he used the word Japs over and over again.
Yeah,
And I didn't know you couldn't say that
Exactly.
until my teacher was like, you can't put that in a paper.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And there are a lot of folks who, for a lot of reasons, they maybe fought in the war, or
That's
they
what it was. Yeah, he was stationed in Guadalcanal,
and
right?
that language was very common. That language is not accepted by the community. So I would start there. I would also
Can you like, is that comparable to using the N-word basically?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that because I think that there is a very different history behind the N-word. And I think that the way the N-word was weaponized towards Black people is very different. And I think there is a really big importance to not say that like Asian Americans have faced the exact same kind of discrimination that Black people have.
Yeah.
Because I think the extent of impact about white supremacy is very different.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important also for Asians to recognize, which is a challenge within our community that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Thanks for making that clarification.
Yeah. But the other thing I would say too is that like I think the church is really unaware of like the fact that Asian Americans are people of color. And as somebody who like grew up in church, I feel like my churches cared a lot more about talking about modesty than about racism. And I think that's very relevant, particularly to the shooting that happened in Atlanta, because we're not spending the time talking about what are the experiences people are having. We're focused on these kinds of like they're important, but like not as significantly long-term impacting the way that we teach and train young people and adults how to treat one another and recognize the different experiences that we all carry.
That's a really profound word for us as the church. That I think especially the Western church has been so consumed on issues of sexuality and sex in general, that we overlook things like you said. That's a really good word. And I mean, I think you told me earlier this week too, like some of your most kind of like harmful experiences came in youth group, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was one of my best friends in youth group that the first time that I was ever called a chink was on a Sunday morning, sitting in youth group. We were teenagers and we're like passing notes back and forth. And, he's writing, we're making jokes. And he writes on this note, "You're a chink." And he like passes the note down. And I look at the note and I'm 16. I don't have any concept of race really at this point.
Sure.
But I look at him and I go, "That's racist. You cannot say that."
Yeah.
And he writes back, "It's fine. I have 4 Asian sisters that are adopted. I can say this."
Yeah.
And I'm like, and suddenly like all my friends see this note and suddenly everybody was quiet. And suddenly they're so interested in the sermon again. They're like, no, not interested in passing notes anymore.
Right.
But it was like those kinds of events happened all the time. Like just like little comments, like jokes about like Josh and I dated in our high school youth group and people would be like, "Oh, Josh has yellow fever." And like adults would hear kids say that and nobody would say anything. And it's those kinds of small comments that lead to an environment in which violent people have the opportunity to commit crimes because so many people have been silent. They hear that joke being made, they hear somebody making that accent, they hear somebody making a comment about how the food smells, but they don't say anything. And then it creates this environment where people who need legitimate mental health care end up acting violently because the people around them have not said, "That's an unacceptable behavior and you can't do that."
Yeah. Oof. Okay. I know we're about out of time. You're going to put the resources in the...
Yeah.
Okay, so they'll be able to access that.
I also brought this book. If anybody would like to read, I picked this up. I'm not done with it yet, but it is excellent. It is called Minor Feelings. It's by Kathy Park Hong, and it is written by a Korean American, and she talks about the Asian American experience in a way that I think is equally... It is... anti-racist, so it is not speaking against Black people or other people of color, which I think is very important.
Sure.
But it also, I think, correctly identifies the invisibility of what it feels like to be Asian American.
Yeah. Whew. Okay, I know this is a lot. This is heavy. Thank you again for sharing and being vulnerable in this space. Y'all, I know Lent has been really heavy for us. We've been journeying this 24 hours with Jesus, and it's just felt really intense. This adds to the intensity because the reality of the lived experience right now is pretty heavy. So again, Vic, thank you so much. Yeah. Really grateful for you that you continue to teach us and educate us and be willing to have these conversations. Yeah. For everybody else, thanks for joining us this morning, for taking the time to have this conversation. We'll be back for worship in just a few minutes, so take a break, take a deep breath, maybe get some more coffee, and we'll see you for worship.